There is a photograph taken in Chicago in the summer of 1893. A woman in a white dress stands in front of a building the size of a cathedral. Behind her, a lagoon reflects a skyline that looks like ancient Rome. Colonnades, domes, fountains running day and night. The building behind her is called the Palace of Fine Arts. It is 600 feet long. It took 18 months to construct. In the photograph, it looks like it will stand for 1,000 years. It was demolished 14 months after this photograph was taken. Not destroyed by fire, not taken by war, not condemned by structural failure. Demolished systematically, on purpose, by the same people who built it. This was not an accident or a tragedy. It was the plan from the beginning. And the question nobody asks when they talk about the great world's fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries is not why the buildings came down. The question is what those buildings were actually built to do, because it was not what they told you. Before 1851, there was no such thing as a World's Fair. The concept was invented in London that year by a committee organised under Prince Albert, who wanted a venue for Britain to demonstrate industrial supremacy to the rest of the world. The Crystal Palace was built in Hyde Park in 6 months. It covered 19 acres. It housed exhibits from 40 countries. 6 million people visited in 5 months. Then it was disassembled, relocated to Sydenham and burned to the ground in 1936. The model spread immediately. Paris hosted in 1855, 1867, 1878, 1889 and 1900. Philadelphia in 1876, Chicago in 1893, Buffalo in 1901, St. Louis in 1904, San Francisco in 1915. Every major industrializing nation organized one. Every host city spent money it did not have to build structures it would not keep on land it needed to control. That last phrase is worth slowing down on. Land it needed to control. The 1893 Chicago Exposition was held on a 600-acre site on the South Lakefront called Jackson Park. Before the fair, that land was marsh and scrubland. The surrounding neighborhoods were working-class immigrant communities, predominantly Polish, German, and Irish. The city did not acquire that land through normal market mechanisms. It was cleared, consolidated, and transferred to the fair's organizers through a combination of eminent domain proceedings, political coordination, and the quiet cooperation of the Chicago real estate industry. The people displaced were not compensated at market value. They were given legal process and told to leave. The man directing the construction was Daniel Burnham. He was 36 years old, one of the most ambitious architects in America, and he had never managed anything remotely this large. He was given 18 months and a mandate to build a city, not a temporary exhibition, a city. He called it the White City because every building was painted white, unified into a single architectural vision that Chicago, in its smoke and disorder, could never actually be. The buildings were made of a material called staff. It was a mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and jute fibre that could be moulded into any shape and painted to look like stone. It was inexpensive, fast to produce, and had a lifespan measured in years rather than decades. Burnham and his team knew this. The exposition's directors knew this. The decision to build in staff rather than permanent materials was not a compromise forced by time or budget constraints. It was a deliberate choice. The buildings were designed to disappear. 6 months after the fair closed, demolition crews moved in. The Palace of Manufactures, the largest building in the world at the time, covering over 30 acres of floor space, was dismantled piece by piece. The transportation building came down. The electricity building, the mines building, the horticultural hall, the massive basin of the Court of Honor, which had held the reflecting lagoon visible in every photograph from the fair, was drained and filled. Within a year, almost nothing remained. The site was cleared for a public park that the city had always intended to place there, on land that had been made available for that purpose by the displacement of the communities that previously occupied it. What the fair left behind was not its buildings. What it left behind was debt, mythology, and a transformed real estate market. Chicago took on roughly $11 million in public obligation to support the exposition. In 1893 currency, that figure represents decades of taxation across an entire city. The average laborer in Chicago that year earned between $400 and $600 annually. The fair employed thousands of those laborers to construct buildings that were always going to be demolished. The contractors who received construction contracts were the same men who sat on the exposition's board of directors. The architecture firms commissioned for the major buildings were the most well-connected firms in the country, selected not through open competition but through relationships Burnham had cultivated over a decade of professional life. The fair attracted 27 million visitors in 6 months. The hotels, restaurants, rail lines, and transit companies servicing those visitors generated enormous private revenue. The question of who captured that revenue and who absorbed the public cost was never central to the official narrative. The official narrative was about civilization, progress, the unity of nations, the triumph of American industry rising from the rubble of a city that had burned to the ground just 22 years earlier. There is a phrase that appears repeatedly in contemporary accounts of the 1893 fair: White City. It referred to the buildings, the unified whiteness of the staff facades, the planned symmetry that Chicago's actual streets could never provide. But it also carried a meaning that contemporary writers acknowledged directly and that later accounts tend to soften. The exposition's midway and main exhibition halls were deliberately segregated. African American exhibitors were systematically excluded from the primary buildings. Frederick Douglass, who was 75 years old and had spent half a century dismantling the arguments used to justify that exclusion, attended the fair on what was designated Colored People's Day and delivered a speech that portions of the assembled crowd attempted to shout down. The White City was white in both senses of the word. The demolition erased the buildings. The mythology kept everything else intact. The pattern repeated across every subsequent fair with a consistency that eventually stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a method. The 1889 Paris Exposition constructed the Eiffel Tower as a temporary structure. It was contractually obligated to be demolished after 20 years. It survived because it proved useful as a radio transmission antenna, and because enough Parisians had grown attached to it that removal became politically untenable. This is the exception that history remembers. The rule was demolition. The Trocadero Palace, the Galerie des Machines, the vast majority of everything built for 1889 was gone within a decade. The tower survived despite the plan, not because of it. The 1901 Buffalo Exposition was constructed on 350 acres in Delaware Park. The site required clearing residential properties and redirecting a creek. It is remembered primarily because President McKinley was shot there on September 6th, 8 days before he died. It is not remembered for what happened to its buildings. They were demolished within months of closing, and the land was absorbed into the park system that Buffalo's real estate interests had been lobbying to expand for years. The 1904 St. Louis Fair was held on 1,200 acres of Forest Park, cleared from what had been mixed residential and agricultural land on the city's western edge. The fair cost approximately $50 million. The state of Missouri contributed $1 million. The federal government contributed $5 million. The city of St. Louis and its residents absorbed the remainder through bonds and assessments that were paid off over the following 2 decades. The construction employed over 10,000 workers for 2 years. When the fair closed in December, demolition employed several thousand more. The economic benefit of all that organized labor flowed almost entirely to a concentrated group of land developers who had acquired surrounding parcels before the fair's location was publicly announced. The 1915 San Francisco Panama Pacific Exposition was built on 300 acres of filled bay in what is now the Marina District. That land did not exist before the fair. It was created by dumping rubble and debris from the 1906 earthquake into the bay, converting the physical remnant of disaster into developable real estate. Every building constructed on that site was designed and contracted as temporary. Every building was demolished after the fair closed, with one exception. The Palace of Fine Arts was preserved through an active citizen campaign. It stands today. It is the only structure from that fair that survived, and it survived because individuals organised specifically to save it against the default outcome. Everything else proceeded as planned. This is the argument that nobody assembles as a single case. These were not celebrations of human achievement that happened to be temporary. They were temporary by design, because the point was never the buildings. The point was the land transformation that the buildings made politically achievable. Consider the mechanism carefully. A city wants to clear a section of land for redevelopment or for a public works project that will enhance adjacent private property values. The communities on that land resist displacement because they have nowhere to go and nothing to gain. But if that same land can be positioned as the site of an internationally significant event, the displacement becomes something else entirely. It becomes a civic contribution. The demolition of existing structures becomes preparation for greatness. The remaking of the landscape becomes a gift to the future. And then, once the fair ends, and the buildings come down, and the debt is distributed across the city's tax base, the land is exactly where certain parties needed it to be. Cleared. Improved with infrastructure funded publicly. Reframed in the collective imagination as a place of significance and possibility, rather than a place where people had lived. The people who paid for that transformation were not the people who benefited from it. This held true in Chicago in 1893, in Buffalo in 1901, in St. Louis in 1904, in San Francisco in 1915. In every major host city of this era, the land values surrounding former fairgrounds rose sharply in the years following demolition, generating private returns for investors who had positioned themselves before the public announcement. The infrastructure improvements paid for by public bonds remained. The communities displaced to create the sites did not return to them. What the World's Fair era produced across 50 years of practice was a repeatable template, a mechanism for using spectacle to accomplish land transformation that would have faced direct resistance if pursued through ordinary political channels. The buildings were the spectacle. The temporary nature of the buildings was not the sacrifice, it was the strategy. Build something magnificent enough to justify displacing thousands of people. Invite the world to witness what magnificence looks like, then tear it down before anyone can ask too many questions about what was there before. Burnham went on from the 1893 fair to develop the Plan of Chicago in 1909, a comprehensive vision for remaking the city along aesthetic lines first tested at the Exposition. It was funded entirely by the Commercial Club of Chicago, an association of the city's largest business owners. The improvements it recommended were concentrated in areas that served the Commercial Club's members. The neighborhoods with no representation in that organization were addressed primarily as problems to be managed or spaces to be cleared. There is one building still standing in Chicago from the 1893 Exposition. The original Palace of Fine Arts was constructed with permanent materials because it was intended to house artwork that required stable environmental conditions, and because the cultural institutions backing it had sufficient influence to demand a different standard than the rest of the fair received. It is now the Museum of Science and Industry. It sits on the South Lakefront, surrounded by the public park that the fair's demolition made possible, on land prepared for that purpose through a process the mythology of the White City made very difficult to question at the time, and only slightly less difficult to question now. Every other building from that fair is gone. The staff material that made them look like eternal stone is scattered in the ground across Chicago's South Side. The workers who built them moved to other projects or returned to the factories. The debt was retired over decades through property taxes assessed on the same neighborhoods that had been cleared to create the site. The woman in the white dress in the photograph has been standing in front of that building for 130 years. The building has been gone for 129 of them. The fair was real. The buildings were real. The experience of 27 million visitors was real. None of that is in dispute. The question is what you call something when the grandeur was always temporary, the debt was always public, the benefit was always private, and the land was always the point. They called it a World's Fair. The world came. The buildings came down in 6 months. And what remained was exactly what it had been built to become.